In the early days of our relationship, my wife once asked me, "Hey, what would you do if I cheated on you?" "If you asked me, I would cry and get angry," she said. "I won't get angry, but I will grow distant and cold," I told her. "Such a lonely and cold person you are, huh?" she laughed. Just as she had said then, I've now turned completely distant and cold. Am I really such a lonely person? But it was my wife who made me like this. 3 years ago, on a certain Sunday, I woke up early and was determined to clear up the suspicions I've had for the past 2 months. I snuck a look at my wife's cell phone. My wife told me yesterday that she'd made plans to hang out with a friend in the afternoon. As I read the incoming messages from her inbox, I found something I did not want to see. From the message, it was clear she was planning to see a lover, not a friend. There was one message from an address that was registered under a woman's name. The contents of the message made it clear that this was not their first message. It was also clear the message was coming from a man. It's likely that she would have probably deleted these messages. But this time she carelessly forgot to delete that one message. I put her cell phone back where I had found it after I noticed my wife wake up with an innocent face. In a rush, I left my son at my in-laws' house nearby. The email had mentioned an address, a coffee shop located near a station 5 stops away. I quickly raced there in my car. I parked in a discreet spot nearby. I had arrived near the spot she mentioned in the email. It was 10 minutes before the scheduled meeting time in the email. I figured it was about time they'd be arriving. I kept a close eye on the coffee shop entrance. Just as I expected, I soon saw my wife furtively entering the coffee shop. Soon after, the man who I suspected she was meeting with accompanied her out. She was walking happily with the other man's arm around her shoulders. The man looked to be about the same age as me. I decided to follow them on foot. There was a risk of getting caught, but the two of them were in their own little world. They didn't seem to notice me. They headed for the hotel area behind the station. They bought beer at the convenience store along the way. The two of them walked for a little while before entering a hotel without much hesitation. Was this their usual rendezvous location? My wife didn't seem to show a single sign of hesitation. I went back to get my car and parked in front of the hotel. The two of them were in the hotel for about 2 hours. Like flipping through a photo album, I kept thinking back on the old times between us. From the beginning of our relationship, our marriage, to the birth of our son, we had our fights, but I thought we were pretty happy. I thought my wife had also believed the same. Emotions such as anger or regret never really came up between us. I was really looking forward to our future together. Even thinking about it now, I believed our relationship was quite calm. After a bit of time, a couple exited from the hotel. I confirmed that it was them, and then exited my car. I stood in front of them both. When she saw me suddenly standing in front of them, my wife initially had a stunned face, but her expression quickly turned to pale. The man looked at me with a surprised expression, but he understood who I was from my wife's reaction. She started mumbling, squirming uneasily. After staring at my wife for a few seconds, I spoke to her in my usual matter-of-fact tone. "Shall we go home?" I asked. She must have been prepared for a confrontation, but my wife just opened her eyes wide and muttered, "Huh?" I pulled her away and we left the scene. I didn't see what the other man's expression was at the time. To be honest, it didn't matter. Even in the car on the way home, I acted normally, as though everything were the same. My wife had a dazed expression on her face, and only occasionally responded with a nod. Regardless, I decided to go shopping for dinner at the supermarket we often went to together with our son. Even after entering the supermarket for a while, my wife just followed behind in a daze and didn't put anything in the shopping cart. Seeing her expression, I spoke to my wife. "Shall we eat out today?" I suggested to her as we got out of the car. We went to my parents' house and picked up our son who I had left there. We then went to our regular local diner. Even here, my wife was reluctant to pick up her fork. "Are you not eating, Mommy?" my son asked. "Mommy's stomach hurts," she replied. "You can eat my food," she said. My son was very happy and reached for her plate with his fork. My son didn't notice anything different, as though nothing had changed, just an ordinary, nice family meal together. Even after returning home, my excited son was being playful with me, but my feelings toward my son had changed compared to the previous day. This is probably the last time, I thought, as I calmed down with my excited son by washing him in the bath. The next morning I went to work as usual. The only thing that was different, however, was I left carrying quite a large bag. Inside the bag I packed clothes and daily necessities I had packed last night. From that day on, I started staying at my parents' home. My suddenly being at their house was a surprise to my parents. They thought I had gotten in a fight with my wife. After 3 days staying at their place, I returned home to find familiar shoes at the entrance. In the living room were my parents and my wife. Without acknowledging my wife's presence, I said, "I'm home," and headed to the bath. I was soaking in the bathtub when I heard the door in the bathroom open. I sat in front of the bathtub curtains. I could see my wife's figure through the frosted curtains. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry," she said. Ignoring her apologies, I stood up and started to shower. I turned up the shower to drown out her voice. After a while, my wife began to tell the story about her affair. My mind was a blur, and I couldn't hear anything she was saying. My wife finished her story and repeated, "I'm sorry," again. I was getting depressed. "I'll be in the living room later," I said, so my wife would leave the room. I got out of the bath. I then went outside without telling anyone and spent the night in my car. On the same night, my wife went back to our apartment. My parents, realizing the gravity of the situation, started questioning me as I was preparing to go to work the next morning. "I'll tell you when I get back," I told them as I left the house. I received several messages and phone calls from my wife, but I ignored them all. Her voicemails were full of tears and apologies. "Please come back," she begged. I listened to a few words before deleting all the messages. When I started dating my wife, I was always asked this question: "Hey, what would you do if I cheated on you?" "If you asked me, I would cry and get angry," she said. "I wouldn't get angry, but get cold and distant," I replied. "You're such a lonely person, aren't you?" she laughed. Just as I had said then, the person I am now has already gone cold. Am I such a lonely person? But it was my wife who made me like this. That weekend, my wife and her parents visited my parents' house. It seemed like her parents had already heard her side of the story. As soon as I got up to the guest room, my wife, with teary eyes, got down on her knees and apologized. Has she been crying for a while? Her eyes were swollen and red. When my parents saw what was going on, they urged me to forgive her. My intentions were firm, but I didn't want to ask for a divorce suddenly. I felt bad for her parents. We talked for about an hour, and finally I informed my wife of my firm intentions to divorce her. My wife, who had been doting on our son, expressed doubts as I told her that the custody of our son would be hers. "Really? Are you sure?" she asked. I replied in a calm tone. "Yes, I don't even know if he's my real son or not." The room froze in an instant as I said those words. I had poured all my energy into loving my son. I had been reflecting on our time. Whenever I had time, I would play with my son, teaching him to use a fork and politely greet the neighbors. My son has recently been playing catch with me. It's his favorite activity. He was determined to become a baseball player. It's surprising to me now that I was able to say those words so easily about my son. My parents chastised me for those words, but I didn't care. I told my wife, who had a shocked look on her face, up until that day, Ken was my son. I had no suspicions. Do you see the implications of what you've done? Do you understand how it affected my feelings? You and me, in our conversations, you used a tone I had never heard before. It seemed natural for you to do so at the time, just by changing the way you addressed me. I felt a sudden distance between us. My wife let out a sob and lowered her head. After that, we talked calmly and finalized our divorce. Even after the divorce, my wife and son continued to live in the same room they had been living in for a while. However, my wife was unable to find a job and can barely feed our son, and it seemed like she could barely even swallow food herself. Over time, she fell ill and had to take a leave of absence from work. I had heard she went back to her parents' house, collapsed, and had to be hospitalized. My former father-in-law was the one who told me this. My ex-wife was an only child with no other siblings. Before we got married, I would visit her father. "We're having a son," I would tell him, and he was very happy about the news. He doted on and loved his grandson. Even when I was working, he would often call me on the phone saying, "I bought some delicious food back from our trip. Let's eat them together." He would often contact me on my cell phone, but because I often worked late, I couldn't eat with him very often, so my father-in-law would normally eat with my wife and son. After he would take a bath, he would play with my grandson in the living room, and when I returned home, I would have dinner with my wife. I loved watching those scenes, looking back on those scenes. My father-in-law was truly happy when playing with his grandson, and I also felt happy. I am truly grateful to my father-in-law. That's why, even though the frequency of our interactions has decreased over time, whenever he would call, I still answered like before. Occasionally, my mother-in-law would also call. Every time the phone rang, the two of them would apologize to me. I also, many times, replied with, "It's fine, it's fine." Occasionally, my ex-wife would call me, but I had no feelings towards her. I felt completely indifferent. I ignored her emails and phone calls. Over time, she stopped contacting me, but I kept in touch with my father-in-law. Over time, I noticed from his voice that my father-in-law was getting frailer. It seems that my ex-wife had started becoming mentally ill. She couldn't take care of our son and had become bedridden. The once cheery voice of my father-in-law gradually became more somber, becoming harder and harder to hear. So one day I told him directly, "Please stop calling me. It's getting unbearable to hear your voice." My father-in-law was startled. "Yes, I'm sorry, I know, I'll stop calling you." "I'm so sorry what happened to you." "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm truly sorry." Even though it was over the phone, I cried for the first time in front of my father-in-law. I was grateful to my father-in-law, and I was filled with an unexpressible sense of sorrow, and I couldn't help but cry. But the sight of my ex-wife's parents becoming weaker was painful for me to bear. I was truly grateful to them. They were good parents. To have a relationship with them cut off was also painful. But in order to move on, I decided to break contact with them. After several years, around springtime, I heard a rumor that my ex-wife's family had moved. I don't know how they're doing now. It wasn't like I had a vendetta against them. I also didn't ask them for a huge alimony. But I think my complete distance and coldness destroyed my ex-wife. I wonder if this was my way of getting revenge. I live quite peacefully now. I barely remember those days. Someday, if I can completely forget, my revenge may just yet be complete.